Delighted to welcome you to our annual Author Awards presentations. First, my thanks to the Author Awards Committee, as always, and my thanks in particular to Deborah Mercer, who is concluding her service on the Author Awards Committee after many, many years of dedication to reading mountains of material on New Jersey history and New Jersey studies. And I see a round of applause, and Deborah definitely deserves a round of applause for all her efforts, not just for New Jersey studies, obviously, but for all her efforts at the State Library. I welcome you all, and I'm going to turn the program over momentarily just to say again that this presentation is being recorded. If anyone would like to mute themselves, turn off their cameras, you're more than welcome to. And I'm going to turn the program over to Deborah to introduce the 2022 Author Awards winners. And Deborah, we're going to do the Q&A after each presentation. Is that the plan?
Yes.
Okay,
yes,
and we'll have some Q&A. I see some people still joining us. And with that, I turn things over to Deborah.
Thank you. Thanks, Bob. Whilst we have people still joining us, I'm going to give the introduction. Before I progress to the awards, I'd like to recognise the Reading Committee, who this year were John Beekman of the Jersey City Public Library, Regina Fitzpatrick of the New Jersey State Library, Laura Paul of the Trenton Public Library, and Karen Raddick of Rutgers University Libraries. It takes a lot of time and dedicated attention to read the submitted books, and we all appreciate their efforts and insights and give them a big thank you. Now on to this year's selections. Every year, the committee looks to give awards to books published within the prior 2 years that provide a new understanding of New Jersey history and life, offering original research or new insights. The award for scholarly nonfiction this year goes to Constance Escher, for She Calls Herself Betsey Stockton, The Illustrated Odyssey of a Princeton Slave, Resource Publications 2022. She Calls Herself Betsey Stockton is the story of a remarkable young woman who, despite being born into slavery in Princeton in 1798, gets an education, becomes a missionary, founds the first school for non-royal Hawaiians, returns to Princeton and establishes a church and 4 schools. And this wasn't all she did, but I'll leave the author to tell you more. Constance Escher is a retired teacher and former research associate at the Shelby Cullum Davis Center for Historical Studies at Princeton University. The popular category of the Author Awards goes to a book that the committee hopes will hook readers into a deeper appreciation of New Jersey by its approachable style and enticing stories. This year, the committee found that Denville in World War II by Peter Zablocki is such a book. By interviewing the few remaining veterans and mining local newspapers, Mr. Zablocki shows us a picture of a small town preparing for war with its drives and can-do spirit, and then also the home front and the battlefront experiences of its men and women. Peter Zablocki is an author, researcher, teacher, and co-host of a history podcast called History Teachers Talking. Scarlet and Black, Volume 2, Constructing Race and Gender at Rutgers, 1865 to 1945, edited by Kendra Boyd, Marisa Fuentes, and Deborah Gray-White, Rutgers University Press 2020, is the committee's award for edited works this year. This volume continues the work of the Committee on Enslaved and Disenfranchised Population in Rutgers History and looks at the lives of around 25 Black men and women who attended Rutgers and the New Jersey College for Women prior to 1945, and also those who lived and worked in the surrounding New Brunswick area and their relationship to the university. Kendra Boyd is an assistant professor of history at Rutgers University. Marisa Fuentes is an associate professor of women and gender studies and history and the presidential term chair in African American history at Rutgers University. And Deborah Gray-White is the Board of Governors Professor of History and Professor of Women and Gender Studies at Rutgers University. We thank our authors for joining us here today and by their research and writings, spreading the word about New Jersey history. Each author will present about their work, followed by a time for questions. And we'll begin with Constance Escher. Thanks.
Thank you, Deborah Mercer, and thank you to the committee. The title of my talk is Betsey Stockton, Proto-Feminist, Linguist, Author. I thank the whole committee for the New Jersey Studies Academic Alliance Award Committee for this best scholarly nonfiction book of 2022. 40 years ago, Betsey Stockton found me through her period photograph, and here it is. It's also included on the cover of the book, but I thought I'd just show this photograph, which previously had not been given any provenance. We didn't know when it was taken, where it was taken, why, etc. So in the meantime, Betsey Stockton finding me, now Princeton University has named the Betsey Stockton Garden on Nassau Street. Princeton Theological Seminary has its own Betsey Stockton Research Center in Spear Library. Both designations honor a woman of color born in slavery, sailing around the world in 1826 and founder of 4 schools, as Deborah Mercer said, and a church still vibrant in her birthplace of Princeton, New Jersey. As an historian, my task was to find the primary sources for the evidence behind the life portrayed in this photograph. It was to answer with documents how her life and those who knew her were answered the burning questions of the day: slavery, gender preference, poverty, racism. My 30-page biography, published in 1991, also named She Called Herself Betsey Stockton, much used by others, was a step towards a standalone book today, published this year after my teaching retirement, like Stockton, of nearly 20 years of classroom work in the Princeton public schools. Princeton professor Sean Wilentz asked, what thread united Stockton's agency, her revolutionary work? The answer: her literacy, her bilingualism in Hawaiian English, Ojibwa English, and her Latin text attest to this singular skill knowingly exhibited by this freed slave. My book begins with the detective story of identifying this photograph of Stockton through one of Frederick Douglass, also published in the book, and linking hers to Charles Samuel Stewart, Stockton's missionary brother, lifelong friend. Because I love the sea, I wanted to offer my reader verbatim excerpts from journals of both Stockton and Stewart's shipboard writings in 1823, twice around Cape Horn. And in doing so, I found Nantucketer Charles Ramsdell, then on board Stockton's whaler, the Thames, the teenage cannibal of his Nantucket friend, the survivor of the Essex tragedy, now a Christian convert, forgiven, saved. Nat Philbrook wrote, your beautiful new book is a fascinating story Wonderfully Told, which continues the story of Charles Ramsdell. On my book's cover, I used a beautiful painting of Cleopatra's barge because I wanted to emphasize the fact that much of Stockton's work was done through ship sailing, through missionary work, etc. And it's documenting aspects of Stockton's life in Hawaii, her first school for non-royals, burgeoning into a wildfire of literacy that stabilized the indigenous Hawaiian culture, preserving it from foreign exploitation. In Philadelphia, Gaskill Street, quote, infant school for the colored, the reader finds the application of Londoner Samuel Wilderspin's international method of teaching 18-month-old children in the hellhole of Spitalfields, London, saving them from the first pangs of the Industrial Revolution on both sides of the Great Pond, the Atlantic. And Betsey Stockton's first paid principalship and teaching there in Philadelphia. From that school, called to the wilds of Canada, Stockton traveled on the barge canal with this Ojibwe missionary. His name was Reverend Peter Jones, also bilingual, like Stockton. This is the first known photograph, not in the book, of a known indigenous North American person of color. Back in Princeton, by 1837, public school teacher Betsey Stockton was paid and licensed by the township many years before Trenton State Normal School was operational. Her students attended a college prep night school for teens in Princeton, going on to Lincoln University in Pennsylvania, among other higher education. Finally, overcoming poverty, owning her own house in Witherspoon Street, overcoming gender preference as the matriarch of her community, overcoming racism for her friendships on both sides of Nassau Street. I offered the reader the full bibliography that made from blood, sweat, and tears to accomplish this text of narration of this amazing American woman 3 decades before the Civil War. My book should join the national conversation about racism, poverty, and gender preference. Thank you very much. I'm going to read a very short passage from the book in which Ashbel Green tells why Stockton writes to the ABCFM, the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Mission, and in those days, missionaries were rock stars, why Stockton was so unique. He says, a colored woman by the name of Betsey Stockton was given as a slave by Robert Stockton, Esquire, of this place, Princeton, to my first wife, his daughter. By me and my wife, she was never intended to be held as a slave. We deliberately, seriously on the subject of dedicating her to God in baptism, but on the whole, concluded not to do it. Betsey gave no evidence of piety or any permanent seriousness till she was 20 years old. On the contrary, she was at least until the age of 13 or 14, wild and thoughtless, if not vicious. She always, however, manifested a great degree of natural sensibility and of attachment to me and to her first mistress, and a great aptitude for mental improvement. To save her from the snares and temptations of the city, I feared threatened her ruin. I sent her to live in the country with a minister of the gospel, Nathaniel Todd, who was married to my niece. In other words, Green's nephew. With him, she lived between 4 and 5 years, and by the way, attended school in New Jersey. On Mr. Todd's change of place and my coming to Philadelphia, to reside in Princeton, she returned to live with me. At the age of 20, as near as I can judge, I gave her her freedom and have since paid her wages as a hired woman, except for a few months when she chose to go to service in Philadelphia. This woman, as I hope and she believes, met with saving change of heart while she lived in my family during the first summer after she returned to live with me in the summer of 1816. The Theological Seminary has since, as a minister of the gospel in Willington, Mr. Gilbert says that under his guidance, she became a wonderful impression of religion, which was abiding and which she trusts eventuated her conversion. She was publicly baptized and joined the communion of the Presbyterian Church, now Nassau Pres, in this place, and has remained in good standing in that church ever since. Betsey is now about 25 years of age and has never been married. Her health, till some time after she returned to live with me in 1816, was remarkably firm and vigorous. Her services are indispensable. She is incredibly skilled, so valuable that I shall regret to lose them. But she has been, for a good while, exceedingly desirous to go on a mission, and I'm willing that she should. I think her in many respects well qualified for this. I hope she's fervently pious. There's no kind of work in a family for which she is not very expert, but I think her well qualified for higher employment and a mission than domestic drudgery. She reads extremely well. Few of her age and sex have read more books on religion than she, or could give a better account of them. She has no small share of miscellaneous reading and a real taste for literature. She understands geography and English grammar pretty well. She composes her English in a manner very uncommon for one of her standing in society. She's tolerably skilled in arithmetic. She's made all of these attainments by improving her time and privileges in my family without ever going to school at all. She calls herself Betsey Stockton. This from Green, Princeton, September 3rd, 1821. Really a remarkable biographical sketch by someone who knew Stockton intimately his entire life from his diaries until the time he was very sick as an elderly man, and he also preached his last sermon in her church. This tiny portion of her whaleship journal, on the 24th of April, 1823, we saw and made Hawaii. At the first sign of the snow-capped mountains, I felt a strange sensation of joy and grief. It soon wore away, and as we sailed slowly past its windward side, we had full view of all its grandeur. The tops of the mountains were hidden in the clouds and covered with perpetual snow. We could see through a telescope, the white banks, which brought the strong wintry blasts of our native country to our minds so forcibly as almost to make me shiver. But it was not long before objects that were calculated to have a chilling effect of another kind were brought to our sight. 2 or 3 canoes loaded with natives came to the ship. Their appearance was that of half man and half beast, naked, except for a narrow strip of tapa around their loins. When they first came on board, the sight chilled our hearts. The ladies retired to the cabin and burst into tears, and some of the gentlemen turned pale. My own soul sickened within me, and every nerve trembled. Are these, I thought, the beings with whom I must spend the remainder of my life? They are men and have souls, was the reply which Constance made. We asked them where the king was. at Hawaii. They said, Hawaii. We informed them that we were missionaries, came to live with them and do them good. At which an old man explained in his native dialect, which may be thus translated, that is very good. By and by, know God. This beginning of missionary labor seemed very encouraging, and in a short time, our unpleasant feelings were much dissipated, and we conversed with them freely through the former heathen school Hawaiian boys who were our interpreters. We gave them some old clothes, and in return, they gave us all the fish they had caught, except for one large one, which we bought. They remained with us until our boat went on shore and brought us some potatoes, taro, and coconuts, which were very refreshing after our long 158-day journey. I brought my little boy on deck. This is Master Seaforth Stewart, whom she delivered mid-Pacific, acting as a midwife, who was 2 weeks old. Some of them took him in their arms and in ecstasy exclaimed, Aroha Mahatiti, very great love to you, and kissed him. The last expression of affection we could have dispensed with very well, but we have become all things to all men, that we may gain some. They bid us arohas many times and took their departure. Questions?
Thank you very much for your presentation. I'd like to offer you a round of applause, as all our award winners should receive. I have one question for you. Our author awards last year also went to someone writing a racial story set in the 19th century Princeton, a fugitive slave case. How has your work been received by the Princeton community?
This is about my, I think, ninth book talk, so to speak. First award, for which I'm very grateful, with great applause. I did a book talk in special collections in Firestone Library for viewers of some of the works, including Ashbel Green's Secret Diary, which he wanted to have burned at his death. It has been received by book groups, people I know, partially because I think I have been a very fortunate teacher of many students, parents who were extremely knowledgeable themselves and extremely well educated themselves. So the public library started my book launch in March, as promised, from years of seeing me going in there on holidays, on weekends, on school vacations, working as a full-time teacher. I really kind of feel I've shouldered some of Stockton's legacy. One of the questions that might be burning people's minds are, and have been asked again and again by viewers, including my husband's class, a webinar I did, was Ashbel Green Betsey Stockton's biological father? Because that father is never named. I will answer that question in this way. He certainly supported her as he did not support any of his other slaves. Why did she, the mother, Celie, a slave of Robert Stockton, run to Ashbel Green as a runaway, and he was charged with bringing her back to Constitution Hill, where she eventually gave birth to Bet, slave known as Bet, who became Betsey Stockton, self-named, you see, self-empowered. I think there was a huge amount of love between them. And I'm just going to leave it at that. Other questions? Where did I go for research, for example? Well, London, British Library, 3 libraries in Princeton, Nantucket Historical Association Library, etc. those were some of the places. Philadelphia, Historical Society there, of Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. Those were the places that I gathered. And actually, COVID turned out to be a blessing in disguise, because I had kept hard copy of all of my sources. So I was able to assemble from them, reread them, assemble, rewrite. And on Christmas Eve last year, 2021, I finished my last of 472 author queries by my editor, Rebecca. She was diligent, etc. I did not have an agent. I was lucky to get this book published, even though I went to people I thought would certainly want to publish it, by one of my female priests, whose dissertation, Dr. Clara Slade of Trinity Church, Princeton, published her dissertation with stock out of Eugene, Oregon. I submitted my manuscript, waited nail biting for 2 or 3 months, and they came back and said, yes, we will publish your book.
Thank you very much. I think we need to move on to our next
Okay.
presenter.
Yes. Peter, are you ready?
I'm good. How are you? I'm not gonna, that was really well put together. Oh my God, I can't follow that. Good job, Constance.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, guys. I really appreciate it. This is a great honor. And again, if you told me a couple years ago that I would be an author or writing books and getting awards, I would have kind of chuckled at that, because this is surreal to me. So my name is Peter Zablocki. I kind of started this journey to writing this book about my hometown in World War II. It started a couple of years ago, I would say about 2019. I wrote an email to my local historical society and asked them if they needed some help. You know, I wanted to volunteer. I told them I was willing to sweep floors if they needed me to, whatever they needed. I showed up at the meeting and there was a lot of people there. By a lot, I mean probably like 10, but it was a lot of I, and boom, I became the vice president of the Denville Historical Society. So that kind of escalated very quickly. But I have a master's degree in American history, and I just enrolled at Drew University to get my doctorate in arts and letters. So I'm kind of keeping busy with that. But this story really started for me. Again, I wasn't an author by any means. I wanted to somehow raise money for my historical society. So I started the research for Denville in World War II by initially, it began as a means to kind of start a new exhibit at the museum that we have. We have a little one, kind of room museum, and nothing's been changed since the 70s. And I wanted to update it and kind of get some history. Being a high school teacher, I wanted to gather as much history as I could from members of the greatest generation that could be used for posterity and be used by future generations to learn about their hometown and kind of what it meant to persevere through really tough times. And the symbolism really became very, very important once COVID started. So my initial goal here was to really just create a new exhibit at the museum, not to write a book. And I started reaching out to various people in town. I started going to the Senior Citizen Center. We have a Senior Citizen Center. There is women meetings, there's men meetings. I started kind of showing up at each one. I realized when you bring donuts, a lot more people start talking to you. So I started bringing donuts and coffee, and just kind of sitting down. And I wanted to get the history of this town, not really looking at just the war aspect. I didn't want to look at, a lot of my friends were like, well, so you're going to talk to a lot of veterans. And I was like, not really just veterans. I want to talk to the wives that were left behind. I want to talk to the kids that grew up in small town America during World War II. I want to talk to teachers. I want to talk to doctors. I kind of want to have a picture of what it meant to be living in a small town during World War II. And I started this research, and about 2 months later, COVID hit and shut the world down. And ultimately, my research moved over to contacting people via telephone. and I have countless hours of interviews that I have with various people. But talking to one person led to talking to another person, which led to talking to another person, and soon enough, I was getting phone calls from people that a lot of them were actually kind of locked up in various retirement, centers, care facilities, and I felt like throughout this whole process, I wound up befriending a lot of these individuals that their stories made it to my book, and I kind of still keep in touch with some of them. Unfortunately, a lot of them have already passed since I interviewed them, just brief 2 years ago. But it became something to do, I think, for them and for myself. During COVID, we would have phone conversations. I talked to a British war bride, and she gave me an awesome story on how she met her husband from my town, which I'll share with you guys a little bit. I talked to kids that organized scrap drives. I talked to a former priest that organized a D-Day celebration in the center of town. It really was very enlightening for me. And because of COVID as well, and trying to gather information and gain information that I needed for this, I decided to look through old newspapers as well, because there was not a lot of access, and no one's ever really collected the history of my town from just World War II. So I spent countless hours of going through old newspapers. Denville had its own newspaper. It was called Denville Herald. And I was granted access to the digital files of that newspaper by our local librarian, which was awesome with this process. And I kind of just went through it and looked at the amount of stories that people would post in 1940s that today would not be news. Like if Aunt Bridget came over on Sunday, that made the newspaper, and Clark said that Aunt Bridget came over on Sunday. So it was interesting trying to go through all those newspapers. But the ultimate final product, I've gathered so much information that I basically started writing it in the form of a book. And I still did complete the new exhibit at the museum, but I gathered so much information that I decided let's make this into a book. And I broke it into two parts, over here and over there. So there's a picture of this town, not just who's fighting and where they're fighting, although I did find a Denville citizen in every theater of the war, and I made sure I mentioned all their stories, firsthand accounts in this book, but also what it was like living in this town. And a lot of amazing stories that I feel like normally would be lost, that I was able to kind of uncover, you might say. Starting with the draft boards, just local draft boards, and how teachers in small town America, teachers were asked to organize the draft boards, and you had to go to local schools, specifically in my town, if you were drafted, to decide whether you're going to war or not, because the draft boards, the teachers that work there knew you and knew your family, so they would really determine whether you were, you would be, how do I say this? You'd be allowed to go, or you should go, or whether your parents needed you to stay behind. I went through stories where the hometown newspaper and the police, which at the time the police was really only two people. It was a police chief and he had one part-time helper, put a message out that all people that were German, Italian, or Japanese heritage had to hand in all of their cameras, all of their shortwave radios, anything that would make them potentially saboteurs. And newspapers talked about this, that a lot of family members delivered these goods to the police before the collection times, because they kind of felt embarrassed about having to do that. I looked at air wardens. The first couple of years of the war, specifically the first year of the war, there's so much unknown as to whether we could actually be attacked here. And while Denville in itself, Morris County, New Jersey, may not be a target by any means, this was actually addressed at various town meetings. We were close enough to Picatinny Arsenal and also close enough to New York and the harbor to be viewed as part of this tri-state area. And we could be potentially attacked by air raids. And again, very quickly, within 6 months to a year, it became obvious that wasn't probably going to happen. But the first few months, there really was genuine fear that bombs could start dropping. And one particular day, you had a whole collection of bombers flew over Denville, and everyone started running around like, oh my gosh, what is happening? And the newspapers later said, well, these were the good guys. However, you have now an idea of what Europeans go through all the time. You had air wardens, and you had people that basically, in the museum, have all of their dot books. Basically, they sat there and they looked at the sky for hours at a time, and every time something flew, they would mark it. You had sirens that would come off, and you had these drills. One particular drill, the siren was not turned off, and it went off at a time when it was not scheduled. Usually people were notified that we're going to have a drill, and it was a particular Saturday, and it scared a whole lot of people because they thought that we were actually being bombed, which I thought was, again, interesting, because we don't think about that fear being in America as opposed to Europe. Schools had to close because of various rationing. So kids would actually go on a radio in the morning. They would tune into a local station, and you would hear the principal daily tell them whether we could keep the school open that particular day because there wasn't enough oil to heat the building. So you would have to literally put on the radio, and the kids were excited every day. It's like, oh, not good enough. In 41, the school was actually closed for majority of winter, like I would say almost 2 months, because of the fact that there just wasn't enough oil to heat the building. We talked about, these are all stories that I gathered from various people and the newspapers. You had coupons, you had tires, and the idea of how people sometimes try to get away without rationing. And if you were not supposed to drive, the police officers would actually stop you and be like, why are you driving? You shouldn't be driving. Why do you only drive by yourself? Why are you not carpooling? I got a lot of those stories that were very interesting as well. War saving stamps and the different classrooms in schools, because the kids couldn't afford to get a war bond. They only were able to afford a stamp. You had different competitions between classrooms of which class is going to have the most stamps and which class is going to be able to collect enough stamps to buy a war bond. There was a lot of different areas, like I mentioned before, Picatinny. Picatinny employed close to, at the time when I was looking at this, 18,000 people throughout the war were employed at Picatinny. And a lot of Picatinny being very close to my hometown, you would have a lot of advertisements that said, hey, if you have a furnished room or apartment or willing to bring in some workers, rent your room. And there was a lot of people that came to this town that lived here primarily because of the fact that they needed a job at Picatinny. I have a whole chapter in there about women. I actually met former Wave. She passed away shortly after our meeting, and she talked about just different recruitment that was happening in town, and her work in a local ice cream shop, and the Waves and the Wax would come in and try to recruit girls to join the war effort. I spoke to one person who was one of the first aid of the Denville Motor Corps. There was about 16 young ladies that were like 17, 18 years old that were basically became nurses on demand, you might say, and they drove ambulances through the town, which at the time was very much unheard of. I talked about one issue that I found also is I looked at a lot of unwed pregnant women, which was frowned upon during World War II, but it was happening a lot more as soldiers were going overseas, that you would wind up having a lot of single young women pregnant. So there was a lot of different churches in town. We had 3 different churches in town would have these drives that would say, hey, we'll help you. If you are not married and you're pregnant, we could help you. There was one case in December of 43 that a baby was left in the pew at a local church, St. Mary's Church. That baby's mom was never found. However, the baby was adopted by parishioners. I never found out the real name of the baby. That I got that one from the paper. The stories that I got in the conversations I had were very enlightening. As I mentioned, some were lighthearted, some were not. I sat through a lot of people crying and a lot of people laughing. It really was an experience. I spoke to Mr. Sipple, for example. He was 16 years old when he wound up being in the first wave Normandy D-Day, Normandy Beach. He was 16. He lied about his age, and actually the reason for it is his mom encouraged it because they were very poor. The dad passed away from a heart attack, and the mom says, I need your military check. So she basically sent him to war at the age of 16. And just to try that understanding, I teach in a high school, and I teach 16, 17, 18-year-olds. And here's this man that I'm talking to in his 90s. And he's telling me how at the age of 16, he was the operator on a Higgins boat in the first wave on D-Day. And his job was to crank it open and open that boat up. And he kept on telling me how he just remembers opening the actual ramp and just bullets, bing, 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 everywhere, bouncing off it, just hoping that it's over. And he would just listen to the actual person that was operating the boat saying, all right, close it, close it, close it. And he would just close it. He told me a story of how they while he were there was somebody that was in the water that was still alive. And the boat captain was like, we got to leave. He's like, no, we got to get him. He's like, well, then you get him. And he talked about how he and another man, there was 3 people on the boat that were Navy on the Higgins boat, jumped in and helped this man up. And then they brought him to a medical ship in the back lines of, Normandy. And he never found out if the person lived or not. But, 16 years old, to me, that was surreal. The War Bride story, that was another one that was kind of fun. She met her husband at a dance, and she said that he was not bad looking and had chocolate, and that was good enough. And the story was really cute. He walked up, asked her to dance. She said, sure. He said he gave her some chocolate. They talked all night, she said. And the next morning, he stopped by her house and asked her to marry him. And they knew each other for a day. And she said, sure, let's do it. So they literally got married that day. 3 days later, he gets shipped over for the D-Day invasion to France. And she, again, knew her husband for a couple of days. She winds up writing to U.S. Embassy and writing to his parents, because he left her with all the addresses, that now she's, hey, by the way, I'm 17 and I'm your new daughter. And the family was like, all right, come on over. So she wound up not really knowing her husband, but she came to New Jersey on a ship, and her in-laws picked her up and drove her over to Denville. And basically she said, they spoiled me. They spoiled me rotten. They were amazing people. And she said, I didn't even care if my husband it wasn't going to work out, but I was going to make it work because I loved his parents. I loved his family. And it did work. They were together for, close to 60 years before he passed away. But, amazing stories, and just how sharp people are when you start talking to them and what they remember when you just start asking them questions. And a lot of times I would start off with 1 or 2 questions, and it really just led to me sitting back. I think the biggest thing about interviewing people is listening, not talking. And that's kind of what it came down to. And once I finished, I put it all together. And I had just published a book also about Denville with the History Press and Arcadia Publishing, and the publisher asked me if I had any other books, and I said, well, I have this book that was kind of like a for me book for me and for the museum kind of thing. And he's like, well, we'd love to read it. So I sent him Denville in World War II, and they got back to me about a month later, and they're like, oh, we would love to sign you as well. So my Denville books, I've written 3 books about Denville, including this one. I've written all of them. Obviously, I'm the author, but for all of them, it says underneath, for the Denville Historical Society. All the money that I've made from these books, I didn't actually make. I signed that all off to the Historical Society and the museum. So every single sale of this book and all the 2 other books from Denville, they go straight to the museum, which is awesome. So we made quite a lot of money for the Historical Society, and we are currently using that money to fix up an old schoolhouse from 1860s. So
Wow.
I'm very glad that worked out. So I laughed at my months of interviewing and writing a book just got us some windows that are period specific from 1860s. But I think that's it. So sorry for taking so much time.
No, thank you, Peter. I'm sure it was very cathartic when people talk to you. Does anyone have any questions for Peter?
Well, I just wanted to jump in here and say congratulations for including the story about the women. Very enlightened, very evolved. This very touching. This child left in the pew sounds like, continuation of the Foundling Hospital. And how did you identify And where exactly is your period 1860s schoolhouse? One of the sad things is that Betsey Stockton's original frame, very small frame building, was burned in a fire as a new schoolhouse was constructed on Witherspoon Street. So where exactly in the town of Denville is your reconstructed schoolhouse?
Yeah, so we're lucky. We have two. We have an 1861 and we have an 1906 schoolhouse. We have two.
Nice.
And they were taken over by the Board of Education and used. The 1860s one was used as storage for the longest time. And then eventually, weirdly, it was converted in like 1950s. It was converted to like a studio apartment-esque house. And someone lived in it. They never had any children. And when they passed away, it reverted back to the town. And the town said to us that they were willing to buy it for us or donate it to us for $1 if we are willing to fix it up. So we said, sure, why not? And the 1912 schoolhouse, which is directly 1906, I'm sorry, directly across the street, same thing. It was a school till 1950s, and then it eventually became the offices, board offices. Then it became a bank. Then it closed. The town wanted to get rid of it. We said, hey, how about the same deal? Buy it for $1. And that's kind of where we are right now. We're
very exciting.
Very exciting to be able to to raise some money for that.
That's wonderful.
So thank you for the question.
I don't know if we have enough time, but let me just ask a question. I did have the opportunity to be one of the readers for these books, and I did like, especially the way this book sort of went into a sequel with your Denville 13 novel, but it's a very different tone and genre, where that one is almost like a true crime podcast format. But this was, I was interested to hear you say that this started its life as a museum exhibit, because once you said that, I kind of, thought back about the book, and it really is like wandering through a physical space with these themes. And I thought that was a very nice structure of the book. So was that structure of the book sort of consciously meant to evoke a museum exhibit, or did just that structure kind of happen out of it?
Yeah, great question, and thank you. When I was writing this book, I very much thought of, I wanted a person that picks up this book in 50 years to kind of immerse themselves, and like, you look left and this is what this looked like, you look here, this is what this looked like, very much like kind of what you said. I wanted someone to read this and have a very detailed scope of various aspects of this town, and kind of like very much like exhibits. What was school life like? What was it like being a woman? What was it like being a child? What was it like, like I kind of looked at all these aspects that I could to really draw it out for the reader to try to put themselves in this situation. And as much as I could in this book, I try to use the real words of people. So I have a lot of excerpts of, letters, interview notes. The idea was so people hear it from, the horse's mouth, as they say. And again, it's very sad, but a lot of the people I spoke to are already gone just in two short years, which is, it's surreal to me. And I'm really glad I was able, and I've had their families reach out, and they were like, I'm so happy, my mom's on the cover of your book, but now she's gone. And my dad, is on the cover of your book, and now he's gone. And
can you show us the cover of your book?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So this is
wonderful.
This is actually Mr. Patterson. He is still alive. I talked to him last week. Great guy. He's over 100 years old. And we keep in touch once in a while. Once in a while, I have to remind him who I am. But once he gets it, he's pretty sharp. So, I talked to two guys that were at D-Day. That same day I talked to Mr. Patterson, I talked to another person that lived in the same retirement home with him. And it was interesting because Mr. Patterson was Navy. And he was shooting, his ship was shooting basically cover, and the other person, Mr. DARPA, was Army, and he's getting on the beach, and they're both reminiscing of the different viewpoints. He was like, I was shooting over you, making sure I was covering you, and they didn't even know each other. They were by any means at the time, but amazing stories. It really was. It was fun for me to write this book, as much as it was a serious topic, and I think it was a topic of hope and how much we could accomplish by working together. And this being COVID when I was writing it, it really resonated with me even helped me, myself, my little kids and stuff. Just the idea of like, we could get through this as long as we work together, we could get through anything. And that was kind of the message that I try to convey through this book. So
But you did that, certainly.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
And
very much.
now I believe Professor Boyd is going to discuss Scarlet and Black.
Me and Dr. White are going to split our presentation. So
Oh,
Dr.
okay.
White is going to go first and then I will follow her.
Thank you.
Yeah, so the Scarlet and Black, I mean, well, thank you for the committee for choosing our book. In 2015, the then Chancellor of New Brunswick's campus, Dick Edwards, he commissioned a study of African Americans at Rutgers and a history of it. This is something that had been done at and was in the process of being done at other universities. He had been approached by a number of students, particularly African American students. It was the 200th anniversary of Rutgers, and there were all kinds of celebrations, and many Black students were feeling alienated on campus. This is in 2015. So the anniversary occurred in 2016, and they wanted to know, well, what are you doing? So the university got with it right very quickly. They asked me to chair a committee to do this history. I managed to bring forth so many of our graduate students at Rutgers to do the research, and in a remarkable amount of time, from December of 2015 really till October of 2016, they pulled together the research and the writing of a phenomenal first volume. And since everyone is, talking and bringing up their work, I don't know if you can see this and whether or not the light is reflecting it. But so we did the first volume, and the first volume is called Scarlet and Black: Slavery and Dispossession in Rutgers History. As I said, this is a 3-volume work, and it has articles on just about every aspect of not just African American life at Rutgers, but also Native American life. I'm going to talk about, just very briefly about the first and the third volume. And Dr. Boyd, who was a graduate student during and wrote some of the articles in the first volume, is going to talk to you about the volume that she edited along with myself and Professor Fuentes. And I want everyone to know that this is 3 volumes. And so if you're purchasing the second volume, which is from 1865 to 1945, please they sell them in all three in a bundled package, so you can get the others as well. But the first volume takes us from the colonial period through the Civil War. And what we do is to trace the founders of the university. And one of the things that we find, of course, is that very familiar names, men like Hardenberg and Frelinghuysen and Livingston, not only were they slaveholders, but they were they trafficked, at least the Livingstons did, in the bodies of Africans. And it's a sad story.
Yeah.
There's no getting around that. And it's amazing that when you go through New Jersey and you see these very prominent names, the Frelinghuysen's, the Hardenbergs, the Livingstons, and you see them on the names of buildings at Rutgers. Something we also did was to put plaques up to let us know who these people were. We need to remember that, again, not only were they slaveholders, but they made their money and their family wealth was made possible through the ownership of enslaved people. Philip Livingston trafficked in, he owned ships, and he brought enslaved people from Africa, and he sold them. The book opens with a story of him bringing a ship full of mostly children and selling them. So we also, one of the other things that we do, we actually start with Native Americans, and we show how it is that the land that Rutgers now sits on, at least the New Brunswick campus, was formerly that of the Lenape people, and how Rutgers came into possession of that land. We also, in that volume, with the story of how Rutgers became a land grant school, and how the sale of Indian lands out west became the money that financed the land grant status of Rutgers after the Civil War. A couple of other highlights: the Hardenberg family owned the family of Sojourner Truth.
Ooh.
The reasons that they knew, in the a dormitory on College Avenue campus is called the Sojourner Truth Homes. The third volume is something, by the time we got to the third volume, I have to say, Dr. Boyd is going to talk about the second volume, so I'm sort of leaving that out. But really, the first and the second volume were relatively easy to write and easy to put together. I mean, when I say relatively, because by the time we get to the third volume, Rutgers had expanded exponentially, and we really weren't anticipating that. So even though the second volume does also deal with Douglas, the New Jersey College for Women, or I forget the absolute the name, but it became the New Jersey College for Women, and then it became Douglas College. By the time we get to 1945, not only do we have Newark, and then we have Camden, and we have New Brunswick, but we also have all of the professional schools. But the third volume tells a story of Black people at Rutgers. I mean, that really what we would call the transformation of Rutgers into the kind of Rutgers that we know today. Rutgers has been highlighted in US News and World Reports and the Best Colleges edition as one of, if not the, particularly the Newark campus, as the most diverse campus in the United States. And what you needed to know in 1945, if you took a picture, and there are pictures of the classrooms at Rutgers and all three campuses, they were, as we would say colloquially, lily white. And so the bulk of volume 3 takes up the story of how that changed, and how African-American students in the late 60s and early 70s really led the way to transforming Rutgers to a very diverse university. The other thing that we talk about in that chapter, we have to pick and choose because there's so much history there, but we talk about the Imus, his infamous comments about the New Jersey basketball team. We talk about the protest and on campus to get Rutgers to divest from South Africa. We also talk about African-American, and as well as just the students' protest to support Assata Shakur. And in the very epilogue of the book, we introduce Jonathan Holloway, Professor Jonathan Holloway, Dr. Jonathan Holloway, the new president of Rutgers University. So that's a look at volumes 1 and 3. And I'm going to turn it over to Kendra, so you can talk about it.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Have a slide. Okay, can everybody see my screen?
I can.
Yes.
Okay, great. So I'm just going to talk briefly about Scarlet and Black Volume 2, Making Race and Gender at Rutgers, 1865 to 1945. As Dr. White mentioned, I started on Scarlet and Black for Volume 1 as a PhD student, and then I was so excited after I graduated to become the first Scarlet and Black postdoc, where I helped Dr. White and Dr. Fuentes to guide the graduate students in doing the research and then subsequently edit the second volume, which the cover is on your screen. And it was great writing Volume 1 because we were uncovering all this history, getting at the roots of slavery and racist dispossession in Rutgers history. And we tried as hard as we could to highlight the stories of Black people in the first volume, but there were just so many limitations with the archive. So it was exciting when we got to Volume 2 to actually be able to find the first Blacks who attended Rutgers, to tell their story about their lived experiences, being able to use their own words, having pictures of them. It was just a very different project than the first volume. So that was very exciting. So to just go over briefly some of the things that we cover in Volume 2, the book opens with the story of Eli Walden, who is pictured here on the screen. And he was a Black man who was enslaved in North Carolina prior to the Civil War. After gaining his freedom, Walden walked from North Carolina to Washington, D.C., and then on to New Jersey. Walden was one of the first 2 Black students to pursue education at the New Brunswick Theological Seminary, which was closely linked with Rutgers and had previously been a part of Queens College, which was the former name of Rutgers. The book focuses on the period 1865 to 1945 and examines the opportunities, but also the limitations of freedom for African Americans, both at Rutgers and in New Brunswick more broadly. We have a chapter that examines African Americans in the shadow of Old Queens, which highlights Black life and labor in New Brunswick. For the most part of the book, we explore the Forerunner generation, which were the first Black alumni at Rutgers College and also in the early years of Douglas College, and the first women of color who were students there. The book also includes a case study of Rutgers and Douglas alums who were racially ambiguous and chose to pass as white. The book explores the social activism and race work of Black students and alumni at the local, national, and international levels. The second volume takes us through World War II era and sets the stage for the on-campus student activism that Dr. White talked about, which was explored in Scarlet and Black Volume 3, which was published by Rutgers University Press in 2021. So I just wanted to talk briefly about some of the Forerunner generation. I have on the screen here James Dixon Carr, who was the first Black graduate of Rutgers College, as well as Paul Robeson, who was groundbreaking in so many ways, but sort of the most well-known Black graduate of Rutgers. And for this Forerunner generation, we talk about how they had to navigate being Rutgers men and race men. The concept of a Rutgers man was somebody who had, sort of the upstanding that Rutgers alums and graduates were supposed to carry into the world. Rutgers man ideals included things like civility, respectability, honor, intelligence, athleticism, social adeptness, and attractiveness. The Rutgers man was a credit to his family, to Rutgers, and the nation. But the Rutgers man was also conceived of as being white. At the same time, we have existing at this time the idea of race men and race women. And for this idea, elite Blacks were supposed to represent the race. They had obligations to try to uplift the race. They tended to be educated, either teachers, doctors, lawyers, or maybe pastors, business owners. And there were a lot of pressure on race men and race women to be perfect, to be outstanding, because any mistake they made individually wouldn't be attributed to them, it would be attributed to the race, right? If you slipped up and you made a mistake in college, then it automatically jumps to that, well, Black people aren't smart enough, or Black people don't have what it takes, right? So there was a lot of pressure on this forerunner generation to be representative models of Blackness and to navigate the racist climate that existed at Rutgers in order to pave the way for all of the students that came later that we see in the third volume. In terms of the women at Douglas College, the first graduate was Julia Baxter Bates, who actually was admitted accidentally. It was at the time New Jersey College for Women. They didn't realize that she was Black when they admitted her. And once they did, they tried to pressure her to leave. However, her father, who was a civil rights activist, pushed for her to be able to stay, which again helped to open up. I mean, it was sort of a slow trickle, right, of other Blacks who could then come to New Jersey College for Women and then Douglas College. And the same as it was at Rutgers College for the men, at Douglas College, there was a racist culture, a racist climate. I have a picture here on the screen of a Parents' Day where the parents would come visit the college, and the students would put on performances and other activities for the parents. And we see here, this is from 1941. So even after Julia Baxter Bates first attended, a white student in blackface dressed as a mammy here on the left side of my screen. So this just speaks to how the white supremacist culture that existed in the United States at the time, in New Jersey, in New Brunswick, was inherently part of Rutgers and Douglas College. And for African-American forerunner generation, they were fighting it not only at the university, but then through their careers, they continued to fight for justice and to bring down the system of white supremacy in the United States. And I just wanted to highlight another thing that we talk about in the book is the rise of the Ku Klux Klan in New Jersey, in Middlesex County, and in New Brunswick. On the screen, I have a picture of a KKK rally in New Brunswick, as well as a bond for the Rutgers Klan, which was the name of the New Brunswick chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. So again, just sort of trying to illustrate that what was at stake for this early generation of Black students was not just getting an education. It was not just being a pioneer at Rutgers, but trying to change the reality of the country where being Black in America was dangerous every step of the way, and that they at times put themselves in danger in order to become the pioneers that they were. I think I have one more slide. Okay, yes. My final slide is just, I wanted to shout out all the contributors to this volume. Marisa J. Fuentes, who couldn't be here with us today, but was another of the editors. Deborah Gray White, of course. Both Dr. Fuentes and Dr. White led the whole Scarlet and Black project, so they put in a lot of hard work over the years. But for volume 2, our chapter authors who were graduate students at the time included Beatrice J. Adams, Sean Armstead, Maya Carey, Sherry Cunningham, Tracy Johnson, Eric Katata, Brennan Sutter, Pamela Walker, Megan Weirda, Caitlin Weisner, and Joseph Williams. And I think most of these people, the authors, have now graduated with their PhDs and are professors scattered all across the country. But of course, it was their hard work of going into the archives across the entire state, from Newark to Trenton, and of course, a lot in Middlesex County, in order to find this story and put it all together. So I just wanted to thank them for their hard work. And that concludes my part of the presentation.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions? I'd just like to thank you for the in-depth research that you did. You know, it's so common when you're having an institutional celebration to not do a deep dive into the warts of the institution. So I think all your detailed research is just invaluable. So you Did you do most of your research in Rutgers University archives?
Most of the research, I mean, I would say the majority of the research was done in Rutgers Special Collections and University Archives, as well as Douglas College has its own smaller archive. So cooperation with them was really important, but also the state archives, and then really archives all around the country, because as I mentioned, we sort of examined the trajectory of the alumni, you know, before and after Rutgers, and many, I mean, most of them went on to have illustrious careers where they were educators, or they were politicians, they were activists. So tracing these people even after Rutgers required, you know, going to archives in the South, or, you know, working with archives in the South to get scans. Some of these people were Tuskegee Airmen, right? So the research was extensive, but most of it I would say, yes, was done in the special collections at Rutgers University.
I'd like to add to that, just to say this, that the very first chapter of the first volume, volume 1, was done by undergraduates. Let me emphasize.
Wow.
So that we had our specialists in Native American history. She was doing a seminar at the time, and she put her students on it. And this is a credit to, I mean, this is just to shout out all, you know, the wonderful undergraduates that we have. So there are about 25 undergraduates who did the research for that. And this was the article that dealt with how the land that Rutgers is on in New Brunswick passed from the Lenape to the hands of the Dutch, to the people who came in the Dutch Reformed Church.
I could ask several questions,
Sure.
but I also want to make the comment that I'm a UMDNJ person who was integrated into Rutgers in 2013 with the medical school. Is the medical school featured at all in volume 3, or is that sort of still way too recent? The reason I ask is you may want to send some graduate students up to my archives up here in the basement. Obviously, the stories of Newark's and Rutgers Newark urban renewal project and so on in the 1950s, but the medical school's urban renewal, I think, would lead to a very different kind of land acknowledgement if we ever were to pursue something in that direction. Just a comment, I don't know if you want to talk about the medical school situation at all, or the urban renewal of Rutgers Newark.
All I can say is that you know, we had to pick and choose, because by the time we did the 1945 to the present, we could have done a whole nother 3 volumes. And so at least at this point, the volume, the collection of work that we have, as far as books are concerned, I have, of course, hung it up, so to speak. I'm not going to be doing that, but we do have the Institute for the Scarlet and Black Institute now at Rutgers, and they are undertaking all kinds of publishing projects. It could very well be that another separate volume that's not part of this is in the works. It certainly would be incredibly interesting. I agree with you, but I think that you're gonna have to wait for somebody else to find it really interesting to do it.
Thank you. One real quick, I know Nancy wants to ask you a question, but one real quick thing, when you mentioned that the 3 volumes were being sold by Rutgers University Press as a package, I went and quickly looked it up, and it's quite a deal because Rutgers University Press through the end of the month is 50% off.
Oh,
So I'd encourage anybody. Normally when we have these book talks, then I go out and buy the books afterward. So now I got to buy the Betsey Stockton book. Now I have to buy multiple Denville books. And now I also have to buy the whole 3-volume set of Scarlet and Black. But fortunately, Scarlet and Black, again, is actually on a gigantic sale right now. So for anybody interested, take a look at the Rutgers University Press website and look at the package deal on that. And now I see multiple hands raised. I won't say anything else. John Beekman. Oh, Nancy was first.
Yes.
I'll be quick. I thought it was interesting of the picture of the certificate of the KKK, and especially that it acknowledged or talked about the women in the Klan, because that That's a part that I don't think ever gets spoken about. My family is Catholic, and they actually had a cross burned in Denellen on their lawn when they moved in. So it's particularly interesting to me, the Middlesex County connection with the KKK. But that was the first time I saw a certificate that acknowledged the women of the Klan, because they would have been the ones that would have had us sew the costumes for the men. So that's an area I think needs a lot more research at some point. Thank you.
I did just want to say that Special Collections at Rutgers has a huge collection on the KKK in New Jersey. I forget the man's name who was going to write a book about it, but then he ended up just donating all of his materials. And it's for every county, every city that he could find anything about the Ku Klux Klan in New Jersey. It's just sitting there waiting for somebody to use and write. I think probably a fascinating story.
Maybe I'll have to work on that. Thanks.
Yes, Bernard Bush is the name of the collection.
John, you have a question?
Yeah, it's actually a comment, and you'll see I had to change rooms, so I'm in my library room now, so I'm being hushy. But just I did want to mention, since there are other librarians here and history researchers, we could talk about the content of these 3 volumes. We could have a great full day seminar, but I do want to make sure that people know about the digital library and archives project that has come out of this and has continued to grow, the Scarlet and Black Archives, which is the Rutgers records, and now they're embarking on a statewide project to digitize New Jersey slave records. So this project has not only resulted in these 3 fine volumes, but also an ongoing digital library project. So it's just an incredibly valuable project.
Thanks, John.
Yes, I put the link in the chat, so if people want to check that out, they can do that.
Oh, great.
Good. Any other questions?
I wanted to ask how much detail and how you found Philip Livingston's slave ship that carried children. Was the ship named? Was there a destination? Was there an export place in Africa about this ship?
Actually, the ship was named the Wolf.
Ooh.
Okay, and the information actually for that, because I used it in the introduction,
Right.
that comes from the book Ebony and Ivy.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And
Familiar with that book.
Craig Wilder
Mhm.
is the author.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that book. There were some
And,
misnomers about Betsey Stockton in it, but I'm sure other parts are correct.
I used that, just to, well, it was a great, it's a sad and incredibly tragic story, but just to jolt people into an understanding that Philip Livingston, and he's revered at Rutgers. I mean, up until 2015, or at least up until Craig Wilder came across that story, I don't think anybody would have thought, oh, how did they, why is he a founder of Rutgers University? And how does he become a president out of the Hardenbergs, the Frelinghuysen's? Where, they came into their money by buying and selling human beings. And it's just one of the ways that I hopefully was able to startle people into that understanding. And for those people, I just want to make this clear. We are not doing this, and we did not undertake this to denigrate Rutgers in any way. In fact, by the time we got to the 3rd volume, it was like, look at how change comes about. And look at how we can, and Rutgers did answer the call of first of all, this entire volume or 3 volumes came about because students demanded it. And look at when students demanded that, you know, Rutgers change in the late 1960s and early 70s. Rutgers answered that call. Jonathan Holloway is actually a product of that answering of call, because he is somebody who is an expert in African American history. And in the latest, in the late 1960s and early 70s, no one was doing African American history. As a field of study, it was, you know, it was definitely on the margins of history. So it does demonstrate how a university that was once one way can become another university that celebrates the way it changed. And that's what I want people who might be watching this or who watch this in the future to think about this. Rutgers used to be one way and now it's another way.
I just wanted to add that because I was involved as a graduate student writing that chapter where we talked about you know, these early slaveholders, that Roberta Singer's book chapter on the Livingstons as slave owners was important. I mean, we use several secondary sources, but also the New Jersey Historical Society has the papers of several of the Livingston family members, which we did go and consult as well. So if you're interested in more, or if you want more secondary literature that we used, you can send me an email and I can provide that for you.
I'd like to give all our Author Awards winners one final round of applause. Thanks as always. This is always a great presentation every year to hear about a diverse group of books, and really fantastic material as always. We hope that those of you who won awards may want to stay around in NJSAA and come to a future meeting, especially you, high school teacher. We have a teaching award that I think we need to get you on that committee. Anyway, welcome to the first timers of the group, and it's great to see all our regulars. We're going to be meeting again in February. We're sorry we didn't have a business meeting this year. It got complicated. I should say today, and we'll meet up again in February and resume our activities. And our February meeting, I think Melissa Zobro will be our Mappin Award winners discussing their research. And so that's our next upcoming meeting. But again, thank you to all our award winners. Thank you for letting us record this. And we hope to see you again at future NJSAA meetings. Great to see everybody. Thanks.
Thank you
Bye,
so
everybody.
much.
Thank you.
Congratulations, everybody. Congratulations.
Thank you. Congratulations.